Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of our ESG Masterclass webinar series. We're very excited to have you all here. A warm welcome back to everybody who joined us for part 1 and helping us make it the great success that it was. And for all our new attendees today, we're really excited to see you here and carry you with us through the rest of our masterclass journey. Our masterclass is certified, which means that if you attend all 5 sessions from November 2022 to March 2023, we will give you a certificate after part 5 in March. We're looking forward to seeing you through the length of this journey. Our masterclass is the result of some excellent brainstorming sessions after we realized that our community of business leaders like you need a comprehensive understanding of ESG, the concept, its buzzwords, as well as its business implications. I'm Alicia Was. I'm a lead business development specialist at Benchmark ESG Private Limited, and I'm also your masterclass coordinator for today. For over 2 decades now, Benchmark ESG's cloud-based digital EHS and ESG platform has helped businesses manage safe and sustainable operations worldwide and digitally transform their environmental health and safety, sustainability, supplier and product stewardship programs under the larger umbrella of ESG. With this context, we welcome you to part 2 of our ESG Masterclass series, a deep dive into the ESG, where we look at the environment pillar of ESG, its various factors, and how organizations can successfully report their environment metrics. Just a moment. Yeah, and we are very fortunate to have with us Mr. Shankar today. He is a part of our ESG Masterclass team. He is an ESG expert and our lead. Shankar is an environment, health, safety, quality, and sustainability expert with more than 36 years of experience. He is currently an ESG consultant who has extensive experience working as the previous ESG head at Granules India Limited and in EHS and sustainability roles at Dr. Reddy's, Pfizer, Tata Projects, and Sterling & Wilson. Welcome, Shankar. And also joining us are our digital ESG experts. We have with us Chandan Tiwari. He is currently the Associate Director, APAC Subscriber Development at Benchmark ESG. He's a qualified EHS practitioner with more than 13 years of experience in digital transformation, business integration, ESG, sustainability, occupational health, safety, and environment management system implementation. We also have with us Ayush Vidyadharan. Ayush is a manager, subscriber development and engagement at Benchmark ESG. He is a mechanical engineer by profession and holds a master's in EHS with experience working with ports and logistics and manufacturing firms prior to joining Benchmark. Ayush is today a GRI trained sustainability professional with expertise in GRI, GHG protocol, and BRSR. Now, Benchmark ESG is hosting this webinar in collaboration with Bangalore Chamber of Industry and Commerce. Now, here's a brief look at all of our 5 parts of the Masterclass series, and today we are at part 2. So block your calendars for the rest of the series as well, and don't forget to attend to earn your ESG Masterclass certificate. A quick note before we proceed, we're really excited to hear all your thoughts and questions, so please feel free to add any comments or questions you may have in the chat box. And we have a question and answer session at the very end, and we will answer all your questions there. With that, over to you, Shankar.
Thank you so much, Alicia.
Yeah.
If you can stop sharing, I'll do them. Yes, wonderful. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to part 2. Yeah. So today's agenda is pretty interesting. Maybe busy. We'll take a recap of part 1. Some of you were part of the first masterclass. We'll begin with a great context to the most happening event of this year. That's the Conference of Parties 27 and the emphasis thereof. We'll deep dive, as suggested, into the materiality factors of E emissions, water, wastewater, waste, and biodiversity. We will look at the environmental pillar specifically in light of the supply chain and explore the metrics in global frameworks on reporting on ESG with a focus on environment. We will also give you some tips on how we can streamline a program through a digital platform and of course end up with some takeaways there. So that's today's agenda. Like they say, a recap on ESG. All of you, if I ask you which is the most important or imperative of the pillars, you might be divided there, but just to understand what each pillar is all about, today we'll see more of each of these: the emissions, waste, biodiversity, water effluents, the environmental compliance overall, and of course, energy. The next session, we will deep dive into the social and then the governance. So the pillars are pretty well self-explanatory, and they say the governance or the economic is the ultimate bottom line, which talks of not just the profits and profitability, but the overall prosperity. You can't sustain a business without making profit, they say, which is true. But then the most critical bottom line is about the people, that's a social. But the most material factor for most companies, organizations, nations, and the world at large is environmental, interestingly. That's why today's session is something that will begin in the context of the COP27 and explain what there was. As you're aware, this is a conference of parties that happens across the nations with all the heads of states coming together and looking at focusing on the agenda of largely climate change. This year's was about recognizing the voices of the vulnerable nations at Egypt between the 7th and 18th of November. And the effort was towards also mobilizing the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. The various outcomes of the COP27 include the launch of the joint work program of the UNFCCC, the technology mechanism, and there's some nice, interesting terminology that came up also this year. Yeah. And typically, as you're aware, they say that the entire pollution because of the emissions is what started from the Industrial Revolution. That was something in the mid 1750s. The world has traditionally been divided into the haves and the have-nots. Largely basis both, as I mentioned, the economic prosperity and the social equity. Post the Paris Summit, environmentally, we've been divided into the global north, which is the developed nations, the high emitters of the past. They're the people where industrial revolution began, largely Europe and that parts of it, with limited climate action, shall we say, not matching perhaps the damage done. They say the price is paid by the polluter, and this was the global north. And the global south, for the low emitters in the past, the economic prosperity, of course, is equally critical. Developing nations who weren't there when the entire emissions began. Now we have got a term, the global north remains the same. Like they say, a past imperfect is a future tense. But the new global south is the island nations, the low emitters in the past and the present, and possibly the future. The challenge in the future is there's a high vulnerability to climate change, islands, etc., who just might have challenges in the future going past. And the global middle is the high emitters of today, which is why if you notice the last year, countries like India, the developing countries, which is now we can say the global middle, have taken targets and taken net neutrality targets. So this is where this journey began, and this definition is something that really came up strongly. And this is how the voices of the vulnerable nations has been identified. And the reason here is the emissions in Asia are changing. And you can see that the entire journey has transformed there. Asian nations are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, although they might be the biggest contributors to the GHG emissions. So you can see some of the data out here. That's the reason why the COP27 is redirecting the global capital to combat climate change in the APAC region. And you can see that in the graph, there is some countries, Japan's emission is decreasing, India's is increasing slightly. There are some countries where the emissions are growing at a high rate of growth, like China. So this is where the estimates show these trends that's happening, and the projected trends also sees what's going to be the future there. And like I said, the MENA region is the most water-stressed region also in the world. And you've seen the climatic changes happening in the past. As we speak, there is another cyclone striking the coast, the east coast of India. Frequent heat waves, rainfalls, increasing bushfires in Australia and some parts of the world. So all of these is causing intense loss of life and displacement of millions. And India, we heard of the floods in Pakistan last, we are the fifth most vulnerable nation to climate change. This is why the context and the importance of emissions is very critical for us all. And that's why this is most material overall to the globe here. So how then do we identify the materiality factors in our industry? What we'll try and do today is also explain this in the context of some case studies and also give you an understanding of what is material to each of these E pillars in companies that you might relate to. We have on the call a lot of practitioners. We'll try and demystify the terms, and we'll also try and give an example so that this kind of sticks there. So what's the entire journey all about? It's about identifying the material environmental factors. And how do we do this? Normally, we look inside out. How does our business model and activities affect the environment is largely what we talk about. But we also want to look at it from the other perspective. How do the environment factors affect our company's ability to grow and create value? So I guess this is where the double materiality term comes in here. And the company's material factors will change. It will be based on the company's industry and geography, which is logical there. And these are not static, but not exhaustive. And as an example, some of the materiality factors in some industries, in coal operations, you can see the usual list of all of that. Obviously, coal and fossil fuel-based industries, GHG emissions, water, wastewater, and all of that with biodiversity impacts is what comes across strongly as the E factors on material. In household production, it will be water and wastewater management. You might have seen a lot of that. In solar and solar tech, energy management, and some of these are what is most material out there. So this gives you a context in each industry. What is the expectation? What is the material factors that affect them here? Let's deep dive into the first one. And it all begins with GHG emissions. This is where it all began. The depleting ozone layer, the rising temperatures. So to put it very simply, these are the greenhouse gases. They are scoped in 7 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur fluoride. These are the ones that cause the entire damage to the atmosphere. And these are very simply measured through scope 1, which is direct emissions, which are the ones that come from emissions within your facility, within your control, within your premises, including vehicles that lie within there. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions, which comes in largely from purchased electricity, steam, utilities, heating, and cooling, which is used for own use. So that is scope 2, which is directly or bought out emissions. The tricky one is, of course, scope 3, which is the indirect emissions. And that is, it could be from the inbound logistics and the outbound, the upstream activities and the downstream activities. So be it purchased goods, capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, transportation, waste generated operations, business travel, commute, the purchasing, processing of solid products, the disposal of used solid products, the end of life treatment, all of these go into scope 3 here. So this is how there are various protocols, and we will kind of give you a snapshot of how each of these works. Each of the protocols measures each of the scope 1s, 2s, and 3s in a different way. And this is just to give you a comparison of the global carbon footprinting measures. All roads lead to the same way you measure it. And this is how to compare each of these, including the ISO standards. So this is where you could measure your global footprint standards. Largely, it's universal, very simply done. On the global emission reduction efforts, a lot of countries and a lot of companies in the Asia Pacific region, where we are today, there's a lot of focus coming in there. This graph, friends, is from 2020. We see the number of companies in each of the APAC regions taking efforts and reduction efforts there. This, of course, tries to ensure that we stay within the limits. If there's aggressive mitigation, we stay at 1.5 degrees, which is spoke about. And then it's well below, and there's ambitious and assertive kind of targets there. And there's a business as usual target and various other targets that could come from. I'll talk about the CDP in a bit. So this has been the kind of examples there. As we go past here, you know that after the Conference of Party 26 in Glasgow, India has taken actions and committed to policies and plans to reduce the global emissions, which is why now there's around 64 companies at the last count which have taken targets on net neutrality. And I hope some of you on the call are also part of that. So there's been the way that across time for 2020, was 670 companies have taken targets, emission reduction targets. And there's a couple of case studies that talk about Infosys, the targets they've taken to get carbon neutral by October 2020, and built in the strategy. I've been part of some of these journeys there with their entire value chain, focusing on scope 1, 2, and also 3 there, with investments in energy efficiency and community-based carbon offset programs. So this is the way the entire progress has been on GHG emissions, which largely contribute to climate change through this 7 greenhouse gases there. For various industries where GHG emissions are a material factor, like we promised, there's coal operations and emissions from coal operations, use of fuel, mining and post-mining activities, largely are the contributors. Airlines, heavy reliance on hydrocarbon fuels, and that's why the aviation turbine fuel, there's been options trying to do blends and try to get focus there. 99% of emissions are carbon dioxide. And there's been major efforts to manage the fuel critical to reduce emissions. And that's been the transformation that's happening in airlines. Every flight you take, you almost get a carbon footprint, and also some airlines give you a way to mitigate the footprint yourself. Chemicals, largely yes, scope 1 emissions from manufacturing and cogen operations. They also do assess scope 3 for the hotspots, because they will have a large materiality coming in from inbound and outbound logistics there. Oil and gas, of course, emissions from flaring and power generation equipment, a lot of real-time exposure assessment. I've been part of an oil and gas myself, and we began the journey around this around 15 years ago, driven by another company that we wanted to acquire a footprint globally. But this is where emissions from gas processing equipments could help a lot in defining how GHG emissions are critical to even industries that are typically fossil fuel based. So that's the example of some material factors in GHG here. To get into water and wastewater management here. So the goal of water management is to track and reduce water withdrawal, consumption, discharge, and manage the water-related impacts of any organization. This is true for a lot of the entities there. There is water withdrawal, where you measure all the water that comes in, the source of all water measured from surface water, the groundwater, seawater, and other resources. The consumption is a sum of all the water that has been withdrawn and incorporated into the products and released back to the same surface water, groundwater, seawater, or a third party over the course of the reporting period. So water withdrawal, consumption, and discharge is the effluents, the used water, the unused water released to the surface, groundwater, seawater, and likewise here. To give you an example, as we speak, I'm in one of the beverages companies here. In 2017, PepsiCo faced a severe shortage of water due to droughts in Kerala. The big reputational damage at the local level. And since then, there's been a major effort made by some other companies like PepsiCo and taken net water positive goals of 2030 to replenish, in a sense, more water than they use here. So this is where the journey has begun. And a lot of companies, like we mentioned here, Unilever, they was committed to solve the world's water problems through water conservation. In 2019, the cumulative and collective achievements delivered through partnered programs had interfaces with water conservation, where 980 billion liters of water were conserved through improved supply and demand. This is what happened there in Unilever. They also connected with agencies with the Hindustan Unilever Foundation, connected with the Water for Public Good program, to lead to the results that you see out here. And Shree Cement, also another industry there, which is now water positive. Here are the ITCs, the big companies, also, but Shree Cement, they achieved this by recharging 3 times more water than the water they would do. And how did they do it? So conservation initiatives in and around the plant sites, rainwater harvesting, and you see a lot of that happening even in societies, offices, homes, recharging of groundwater, recycling water, maintaining zero liquid discharge across all the sites. So this is how the journey has been on water and water conservation there. And a couple of examples we gave to the context there. A similar materiality factor where it plays out most prominently. Solar tech and project developers, they use ultra clean water in manufacturing of photovoltaic panels. Also focuses on the household and personal products, where the water used as a coolant in the manufacturing processes and the operations there in the regions facing water scarcity. Coal operations has a big impact on local water resources due to coal washing, the cooling and drilling equipment, and transporting the coal in slurry pipelines. The agriculture, the meat, poultry, and dairy also is heavily intensive. The scope 1 emissions from processing involves the raising and producing livestock, the manure, storage, and processing. As you're aware, even in terms of meat, poultry, and dairy in the industry of livestock, a lot of methane that is generated there, which contributes definitely to scope 1 emissions. So this is some of the key industries which really focus on water, and where water and wastewater is material to them here. And you can see that the next war could be on water. It's one of the most scarce resources you can see, and that's a big case for looking at water as a key material factor. Right, friends. The waste and hazardous material management is the third critical sub-pillar of environment. So waste and hazardous material here, it includes all the activities, including collection, transport, treatment, the final disposal and monitoring. We talk of compliance and going beyond compliance. And of course, the waste hierarchy pyramid that you see out here, the most preferred route is prevention, and the least, of course, is disposal. So that is the entire focus there. We'll talk a little bit in the future sessions on circular economy, but this is how we try and keep the material circulation for the longest period without having to go through the disposal route. The finished goods or the outputs of the waste of one cycle is an input or a raw material to the other. And that's why the key waste streams, we're able to identify them, identify the top 7 streams, and look at what they can do. That will go a long way in ensuring that we're able to look at managing stuff through the waste pyramid. Havells, as a good case study, has implemented in India waste management, waste segregation at source. Havells has committed to a greener tomorrow, offering e-waste take back, and a lot of consumers, white goods suppliers have kind of collaborated with the consumers. A recycling service that adheres to the e-waste management rules, of course, but also when the electronic product reaches the end of life, they take it back and recycle it. So that makes it very, very inclusive, and that's the way they connect, and consumer awareness is built in. So that's the other kind of good example of companies that get into the space of managing waste and communicating well with the stakeholders there. Examples of industries where this would be most material: obviously waste management, the management of leachate and hazardous waste, landfill disposal sites. You see a mountain growing up at the border of most cities there. How do we manage that better? Food retailers and distributors, the waste generated at various stages, edible and useful food that kind of goes in as waste, how to ensure that is recycled and put back. And of course, the resource loss in food production. Automotive industry also plays a big part. The waste includes machine lubricants, coolants, aqueous and solvent cleaning systems, the paint and scrap materials, the metal, the plastics. Each of that has a heavy intensity on, you can talk of waste here. The packaging industry, the container packaging industry, also generates and has a lot of material hazardous process waste, heavy metals, spent acids, catalysts, wastewater treatments, sludge, which take a toll on the ability of companies to be able to manage them. So friends, you have a good context, most of you, on what is materiality. And a lot of us do things from what is expected to be done. If you're able to connect your business with some of these materiality factors, I think it'll go a long way in ensuring that it stays connected with the overall purpose of the organization. And these were the top 3 that we spoke about. To deep dive into the environmental factors on biodiversity, a lot of people of late ask me, is something that even in the typical expectation of the BRSR, the basic question is your company in a hotspot, in a biodiversity sensitive area? You answer a no and then move on. What then do you need to do on this? And this is where, when we started reporting on sustainability in various organizations, we try to understand biodiversity from a different perspective and play out how this works here. So biodiversity management, and again, this is very critical to all of us. See, this lost natural resources that cost the global economy $5 trillion a year. A lot of countries in the APAC region, including Indonesia and Australia, that regulate business activities that impact biodiversity. It's coming up strong in various parts of the world, and we speak about LafargeHolcim, a good example in Southeast Asia, which is also focusing on accelerating its biodiversity initiatives in Southeast Asia, as the natural resources are critical to their operations there. Largely, friends, when you speak about each of, when you talk about the Save the Tiger campaign and you look at, the vanishing species, and we have exported animals from Africa and Namibia, why is it so critical there? Because each of these in the tapestry of life has a big impact on us. In the journey across the evolution of mankind, any break in the chain can affect all of us here. which is why we need to ensure, as Lafarge has done, how we need companies and industries to be committed to a measurable positive impact on biodiversity. They've taken a target of doing that by 2030 by actively managing biodiversity across the landscapes, by creating wildlife corridors and protecting from natural hazards such as fires and floods, and performing independent external reviews through various agencies. We've seen that in a couple of other companies, in Nestle in Indonesia. So this is how this works there. And you can see that the forest fires, as you noticed in the past, had affected the lives of the pandas, and major challenges has happened there. So this is why this is very critical there. You see that the four major value chains that account for 90% of the pressure on biodiversity, and you can see some of that in the graph out here, where you can see by the visuals, the food and beverages is the one that occupies the largest pie, as you pie on the chart, pun unintended. Infra and mobility, including housing, public infrastructure, vehicles, comes in second. There's energy, including fuels, power, other commodities, fashion and related FMCGs, including luxury goods, retail, and of course, all others, including the manufacturing, pharma, cosmetics, and consumer industries there. So there's a heavy pressure on a lot of industries there, and you can see this is where this entire challenge comes up strongly out here. Because the immense pressure of biodiversity across the ecosystems in the world, and you can see that each of these, there's a nice index that's been done in the shades of the green and blue, give you an idea of the low, the moderate, and the high here. This is very important for us to understand why, and you spoke about the example of Lafarge, where they connected with a company, like we said, about Fauna and Flora International to focus on biodiversity. And why did they do that? And they come in from Indonesia, like we said. So this is where, as people try and take opportunities to enhance biodiversity for quarry rehabilitation, organize stakeholder dialogues in external expert groups, this is where this graph was interesting viewing here. This graph, friends, is based on a biodiversity and ecosystem services. This talks about the intensity and biodiversity there. Where the ecosystem services are high is the greens, whether intact and moderate is the blues, and the low are the ones in gray. And you can see where we come from our respective regions, where we are on the biodiversity scale. For example, in India, the biodiversity services are depleting, and companies are facing a lot of, for example, they can say that a lot of demand on biodiversity as we grow, and the GDP dependency on biodiversity is very high, since there's a lot of manufacturing, agriculture, forestry, fishing, and other industries depending on the biodiversity the country offers. Hence, the risks are real here. And as we speak, if you notice, even in the couple of tsunamis that hit the coast, some belts that stayed safe were the ones that were having a better, biodiverse facility there. And that's why this map that we're speaking of is very interesting. It, in a sense, refers to how intact countries' biodiversity services are. Like I said, the green are where it is more or less intact, and you can see a little bit of spread, which is far in between there. The grays are where their biodiversity resources can lead to decline, is not very intact there. And while we mentioned India has low biodiversity reserves, it's imperative to prioritize conservation. And for regions with moderate biodiversity, which is intact, promoting sustainable practices is expected and possible there. So this gives a nice global snapshot on how biodiversity plays in here. So friends, while all of us believe that it's all about planting trees and going green, I guess you can see the impact, and having a biodiversity assessment to see the number of species, what you have, what's the biodiversity score, all that is very critical for us here. This is very critical to life, and this is some of the industries that are identified biodiversity as material to us. As the usual suspect is the forestry management by default. The compliance to the regulations related to water quality, endangered species, the hotspots, protection and harvesting rights. And I think compared to the rest of the world, in India, there's a lot of controls in the way that the consents are awarded to ensure that your facility is not an ecological hotspot. How well we are able to comply to that is very important there. And also construction and construction materials. We normally recycle and replace the topsoil, but the removal of topsoil and vegetation in quarrying is another big challenge there. There is permanent alterations to landscape and local ecosystems that happens, which is why most material in construction material industries. In marine transportation, there's a lot of water pollution and damage to the marine life from waste disposal there. Untreated sewage and ballast water discharge also is one of the challenges of the marine jetty operations there. And of course, last and not least, our the industry that looks at the hotels and accommodation and lodging. So the risks posed to a sensitive local ecosystems. As we speak, I'm staying in one of those areas in a water park in a nice area between Mysuru and Bengaluru. The risk posed to sensitive local ecosystems like coral reefs and natural preserves by tourist activity. And that's where I think we have a lot of places to visit in a bucket list. What is the impact of what we do is another important question there. And whether you go to the North Pole or the South Pole or the Great Barrier Reef, look at the impact that we have on the ecosystems there, right? Like the tiger, the coral reef also is a key element of biodiversity. Of course, it all starts with compliance, ensuring that we stay within the environmental compliance expectations and protections, but also going beyond compliance is the expectation there. So this talks about environmental biodiversity. We covered 4 of the key pillars there, and one of the ones that we talk about is the supply chain. Friends, we spoke about the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. A lot of industries report on scope 1 and scope 2 because it's largely within your control. But what is not so much in your control, but you can influence is the supply chain, the extended value chain, because it's possible that in some industries have a heavy scope 3 intensity. And that's the reason why it's important to measure each of the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3s, and especially rather than just look within your premises, what's in their control, play a role in influencing the value chain there. So the 4th pillar, the 5th pillar is on the supply chains here. And what do you expect when you talk of supply chain sustainability? It's all about an inclusive journey on green and sustainability, ensuring you collaborate with the suppliers, build the capacity within them, ensure that you use ESG as a criteria for screening suppliers, focus on the long-term risk and opportunities. Nice term that we have out here. So there is an opportunity everywhere. Try and look at that, balance that. As a lot of suppliers would think that going green means it's about some cost that they need to incur there without looking at the benefits and the opportunities thereof here. And I spoke about a couple of examples where in industries which are very polluting, they've gone ahead and done stuff ahead of the regulations. So it's about leading rather than lagging on compliance there. Being open and transparent about performance, be it spills, good news or bad news, needs to travel. And this is where I think the improvement in the openness and transparency of sustainable reporting is very critical there. It's very critical to ensure that you build in sustainability within design, make it a part of your decision making. Like I said in the first session, ESG is also a tool for importantly decision making, where when you make a decision, you wear the hat of the CFO to look at the decision from a financial return on investment, capital intensity, or risk management decisions. You look at it if the decision is viable, but you also got to wear the hat of the CHRO to ensure that what's the impact of the people, what are the social outcomes there. You can't do a business hurting the people or the community, and also got to be a diverse and inclusive workplace there. So this is a very critical other part of looking at that as a decision. And today we're speaking of the green. Yes, you got to wear the hat of the COO to look at every decision from how bearable is it? What's the impact on the planet? And we spoke about a couple of pillars there on energy, water, waste, and of course, supply chain. So when you take a decision, you got to wear this overall ESG hat of the CEO perhaps, and look at all these as part of considerations when you make decisions there. And when you make such decisions, you ensure that every decision is viable, it's also equitable, and it's also bearable. The decision is very sustainable there. And communicating this is very critical for us. And it's got to extend beyond the business. Embedding these as part of the company's culture and DNA will go a long way in ensuring that the supplier is really green and sustainable. The other thing that we speak about is when we communicate the expectations to our suppliers, it also puts pressure on us to go beyond, to reach beyond. And when it comes to disclosures, the way that disclosure also helps as a double-edged sword, it puts pressure, business analysts, investors, community stakeholders, including people who are wanting to join your companies. They all look at this as a holistic way of measuring the complete company's performance there. And when they do that, that puts pressure on the companies to perform well. So we'll start measuring, and we'll talk about that at the end of the session. How do we measure an environment? This is where measurement also comes in as a big way when you do reporting here. So friends, this is about how you look at green and sustainable supply chains. What are the parameters is what a lot of people ask. What are the green expectations of suppliers? I think a decade ago, India did its first green company rating. And this again began somewhere in a green business center with the first efforts to identifying what are the parameters of green, largely focusing on the E factors there. We spoke about some of them, but this is what you could take as, you could weight it as you wish. The key parameters that you could expect from a supplier: energy efficiency, water conservation efforts, renewable energy, GHG reduction efforts, waste management, material conservation, recycling, recyclables. A green supply chain speak about going beyond your boundaries, going beyond to the entire value chain. Product stewardship, life cycle assessment is the one that's kind of tough, but we'll explain that in a second. But ventilation, site selection, ensuring that you have a green setup there to understand and ensure that you build a green facility, which not just on sustainability looks at all the parameters, also is very critical there. So these are some of the parameters you could build in a small checklist to ask the suppliers to do a self-assessment, to ask them where they are on these parameters. You could do a spot when you do vendor assessment, try and use some of these parameters to assess them there. And that will give you a good idea into how you could ensure that you embed sustainability as the key expectation there. It's a journey as we speak about, it takes some time, and what began a decade ago and is now going strong here. So what, friends, was the life cycle approach? It looks at the product design. What's the materials used in procurement? Where does it come from? What is the kind of intensity, carbon, water, waste? How do you manage vendors? How is the logistics, packaging, manufacturing, distribution, product use, disposal, and cycling? So you look at the entire life cycle of the product from the cradle to the grave or cradle to the gate or as appropriate, and try and assess that from that perspective there. And this is where I think look at some of the parameters and communicate this as expectations of the suppliers. The supply chain sustainability will really start as a nice effort there. So this is the fifth pillar there. Like we promised, we also would like to take you through some global frameworks, especially those with an alignment with the E metrics. And we'll take a couple of examples there. The CDP, it was earlier called the Carbon Disclosure Project. And of course, now the TCFD. We'll demystify these terms as we go across. These are the ones that's most relevant to sustainability reporting. And we talk of sustainability, we're talking of the environmental pillar of ESG here, right? So let's deep dive into the first one, that's CDP, earlier called the Carbon Disclosure Project. This is basically a reporting framework. Some of you who attended earlier sessions have had masterclasses from the CDP themselves. It's a framework that companies use to disclose environmental information to stakeholders. And who are the key stakeholders? Largely, the entire journey of ESG began with investors, funding agencies who look at how a company spends, how it does, and what the long-term sustainability of the company. Apart from them, of course, various consumers, customers, and of course, the most important stakeholder, the employee. There are, in a sense, 3 questionnaires to help you tackle the E in ESG. And we'll also give an example to demystify how this pans out. So the first one, of course, is about, and talk about the emissions there, which expanded about the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So the first one, of course, is the ultimate one on climate change. So most of the CDP questions are on the climate change questionnaire. And this disclosure includes information about a company's greenhouse gas inventory. How comprehensive is it? Does it meet all the parameters of looking at the entire, how smart is it? Including information on the emissions there. So this is the first and most critical foundation of GHG, climate change. It also looks at forest, and we explained that being one of the key environmental pillars, how companies can measure, manage, and report forest-related risks and opportunities relating to cattle. We spoke about the intensity of methane, which has a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, on which basis all the CO2 emissions are measured. Mining, palm oil, and more global drivers of deforestation there. And the last one is on water. Companies can disclose the current state of their water management programs and record their responses to water insecurity stakeholders. And therefore, it all begins in the journey there. When you start doing this, you look at how can you measure, then you look at the water meters, the flow meters, the incoming and outgoing will be there. Then how do you measure it across the entire thing? How do you do a water balance? And this is how the entire journey goes in on a nice progression there. So this is what the CDP project largely looks at, a nice disclosure. And you can see that a lot of companies are now publishing the CDP ratings and rankings on the websites itself as a ticker in a lot of the ways that they measure it financially also here. So what, friends, is the TCFD? This is the task force for climate related financial disclosures. So these are the two ones that largely focus on the environmental. So this is a framework created by the Financial Stability Board to improve the focus on climate related financial disclosures there. And there are a couple of critical sections on the TCFD. I will take you through the key ones. One is the climate related metrics, which expect the companies to report climate metrics that's accompanied by contextual and supporting stories on the basis of preparation of data there. The metrics, of course, includes GHG emissions, transition risks, physical risks, climate related opportunities, and more. Some of these frameworks also, when you want to go in for a rating, you'll be needing to also have, and of course, it's not that you begin with a disclosure, but it's obviously not mandatory, but also essential that you start looking at disclosure through TCFD there. You also need to look at reporting climate related targets that should be linked to the metrics so that you can track the progress over time. For a target tied to GHG emissions in the one above, section C, is to reduce scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions by particular year. How do you take the targets? How do you kind of, every company grows, as you grow, there's increase in the carbon footprint in emissions. How do you then take a net neutral target? How do you do abatement? What kind of tools that you use? How are you able to project it? We'll explain some of the tools that will help us there. But this is the section that talks about the climate related targets. How do you set targets? And in a kind of small brief, we'll mention the science-based targets. We look at how you balance the generation of carbon and the abatement of carbon, and how you balance that is largely what science-based targets is, how you do it scientifically using a tool. Yeah. And the transition plans, and that's the section E of the TCFD, that outlines how an organization strategy, including the focus, objectives, and targets, how they reduce carbon emissions, and how do you really progress towards, like I mentioned, a net zero economy there. The transition plan would also need to factor in changes. You cannot be insulated to the changes that happen, how it's aligned to the temperature goals, the mandates that go across. And you can see across the last 6 months, there have been so many, while it was erstwhile voluntary, we spoke about the GRA the last time, and now a lot of the countries across the globe have mandated reporting on ESG there. And that's why each sector has standards and expectations thereof. Closer home, the SEBI has mandated for the few, first few companies, the foreigners have mandated last year for the top 1,000 listed companies by market cap to ensure that they report it in a mandatory manner for this financial year. And that's been the big journey for a lot of Indian companies. So the compliance and communication tool given by the SEBI under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to report the metrics for this year. And the features of the BRSR, we will give you a kind of snapshot there. This is the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct that oversees what happens there across 9 principles. And we'll give a couple of principles that are focused towards environment there. The principle 6 is the one that relates most to our deep dive today. Our masterclass is on the expectation of companies to respect, protect, and restore the environment and support the environmental metrics and reporting of organizations there. So under principle 6, the companies must report their energy consumptions and disclosure related to also water, and of course, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Of course, other environmental metrics also needs to be disclosed, and that is why the BRSR also has been game-changing. The earlier business responsible reporting has now been progressed to the business responsible sustainability reporting, which is more granular. It also, like we mentioned, has a great interoperability with other frameworks there. And this is where we'll also see across the next few sessions, try and demonstrate how, if a company is already in the journey of reporting it, either in the GRI or otherwise, how we can cross-reference the disclosures under the BRSR to the ones with the global framework there. So how we can interlink it, how they can be mapped there. We've done a great mapping internally, and we'll be able to share that with you so that you get a context there, and you can leverage the advantage of the reporting platforms there. So that is the BRSR that's come up as a great opportunity to leverage for most companies there. And like it is mandated, this is where the journey normally begins. There are various drivers for ESG, friends. It could be regulations, and this is where the regulatory pressure has got a lot of companies, not just the top 1,000 ones, but others also. The SEBI is closing on, and it's got 2 ways of reporting there. There's the leadership indicators, essential indicators, and a lot of other companies, including the SMEs, also are being encouraged to report using the BRSR there. So this is where When you start reporting, like I mentioned, it puts your information in the public domain. You are answerable to anyone, be it investor or any kind of external stakeholder. And this is where the journey becomes very exciting there. So large focus of the BRSR also is towards the environmental bottom line. And therefore, the three frameworks we saw also includes the Indian framework there. Right, friends? So this is a very interesting journey into how we can shape the environmental part of the ESG strategy. Like I mentioned, there's various requirements and requests for ESG, and it comes in from various internal, external stakeholders. But the environmental one is something that directly contributes to your bottom line there. And this is where we can play a large part in helping the environmental aspect of it shape our strategy there. Friends, overall, the expectations of environment-friendly operations, it refers to goods and services, law, guidelines, policies, like going beyond compliance, ensuring that you're ahead of the law, minimizing, ensuring zero harm, no environmental damages, environmental operations. It begins with compliances, ensuring that you are within the consents, you do it in a manner that is leading rather than lagging, ensuring got environmental procedures, policies, look at the elements of energy, water, waste, emissions, monitoring, etc. And the environment-friendly operations expect all of these within or without, within a supply chain or without there. So these, friends, are a key aspect of how you build in proactively an environment-friendly operation to ensure that we stay in a focused green approach there. Right, friends? So that is the context and connection of the deep dive. Today was a slightly busy session because environment has, and we tried to focus on some key pillars there. And if there's any expectations, we'll be happy to deep dive into some of them. How we measure net zero, what does it stand for? All that is something that we'll be happy to talk about. But for the moment, let's kind of streamline our program using digital. Let's try to understand how we can leverage and see this, how we can simulate the scenarios there, and how we can take this forward here.
Thanks a lot, Shankar. Elisha, can you confirm if you can see my screen?
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. So thanks a lot, Shankar, for covering the E part of ESG in brief. And while he has spoken a lot on the environmental metrics, COP27, GHG emissions, as well as some of the global frameworks for reporting as well, I would like to highlight some of the challenges which we have seen organizations normally face while reporting out on these environmental metrics. The first set of major challenge is incomplete and inconsistent data capture process, and also is something that we have discussed during our last session, where an organization, majorly the bigger ones or the ones with a complicated organization hierarchy, are not able to track and capture the data the way corporate intends, right? And one of the associated causes for that is the monitoring of data at an entity or at a site level. Another challenge is non-standard calculation of GHG emissions across the entities within a single organization itself. So now it is very well possible that many of your sites are referring to global standards like GHG protocol or IPCC for emission factors, while others have actually reference to some other sources for the same set of parameters, which ultimately leads to discrepancy in the data that is being captured. So ensuring that the emission factors or the conversion factors come from a single source for a single organization is also very important. Use of obsolete emission factors. So as we all know that these emission factors are updated on a regular basis. Hence, it is very important for an organization to track these changes and update its calculations as and when these amendments happen, right? Ownership of data and verification of data is another concern, and which needs to be again addressed to ensure reliability of your ESG report within the investor community. So this is again something organizations have had a very hard time with, largely due to the amount of data that is being recorded across the E, S, and G functions. Determination of emissions, the scope 3 emissions from upstream and downstream activities. I'm pretty sure most of you from the sustainability background already know how challenging it could be in today's world if your organization operations are complex, or you have a very extended value added or supply chain. And finally, setting up goals and using analytics for strategizing further actions is the end motive, right? That is a part of continual improvement that we are looking at. And this also needs to be done in a very streamlined way, in a very streamlined manner. And if not carried out correctly, can again bring down the whole purpose of reporting itself. So with this, I would like to switch to my Chrome browser and one of our tools to quickly help you understand how a digital tool can actually help you get rid of all these challenges. To start off with, I quickly wanted to show you an example of a dashboard that can be built using a digital tool. And what we have displayed here is an environmental leadership dashboard, which has been built by our in-house data analytics team, which mainly aims at giving a strategic direction to management for taking informed decisions and setting up the goals for the next financial year as well. You can see in this very brief dashboard, we have tried to summarize the total energy usage, the CO2 emissions, water consumption, waste produced, all the major parameters of environment into a single dashboard. Now, obviously, a lot of data goes into these dashboards, and managing that data in a seamless and effective manner is the key to the success here. And that's what I'm going to show you next on how these data can be managed very easily using an online tool. Just a second. Yep. So what I'm showcasing you right now is the sustainability reporting module of Benchmark. And this is basically where the data that you just saw in that dashboard was coming from. So once you have conducted your materiality assessment, which Shankar just spoke about earlier in this session today, you can create an entire repository of your material KPIs and parameters in the system. Right. Once you have done that, you can tag these relevant KPIs from this repository to the relevant entities and set a frequency at which the data needs to be captured. Say you want the data to be reported on a monthly manner or a quarterly manner, a semi-annual manner, or an annual basis. Right. Once you have tagged that also, once the initial setup of mapping environmental KPIs to the sites is over, that is where the individual responsible users for each site can come in and key in the data for their respective entities for a period, right? While this data is being keyed in, it would also generate an audit trail for the entries that have been made. So it will ultimately make sure that the data that is entered into the sustainability reporting platform is completely verifiable and auditable at any moment. The data entry can be done through the web interface of what I'm showing you now. You can also leverage the Excel batch templates, using which you can key in data for multiple months, multiple parameters, and multiple entities at a single go. And you just have to upload that particular Excel file into the system to record them. There are other ways as well. You can also integrate the solution with your current third-party system. Say you're using Oracle or you're using SAP, you can also integrate it with those systems and pull in the data without manual intervention as well. Once the data is keyed in for the financial year, it can be again rolled up for the corporate team using multiple charts and reporting options available within the tool. Or you can also look at building customized dashboards, just like the one I showed you before, to suit the purpose of the organization. These reports ultimately can be used to support the sustainability or ESG report that you are drafting, or to give the management an overview of the entire sustainability performance of your organization in a single glance. With that, I'll just move on to another section. Just a second. Yeah. So you can see that basically, we all know that there is a significant overlap of parameters across multiple global frameworks that were discussed earlier, right? Even Shankar was also talking about CDP, TCFD, and all these standards, and you could see that multiple parameters like scope 1 or 3, 1, 2, and 3 emissions, they were also being repeated, right? So similar manner, we have also tried to map some of these parameters which are being repeated in multiple frameworks, and we have tried to map them inside the solution suite itself. So what you're seeing right now is the screen for ESG Director's solution of benchmark. And let's take as an example scope 1 emissions. If I go to view guidelines, I can quickly see that the same scope 1 emissions is requested as a requirement by standard GRI 305, as well as is a requirement under section 110 of SASB, and is also asked as a requirement under principle 6 of the essential indicators as well. So you can see that a mapping has been done for this particular parameter, cross-referencing it with the requirements under multiple frameworks, right? It basically facilitates that you don't have to do multiple, data entry while you are reporting for multiple frameworks at the same time. So I think that was my bit where I quickly wanted to run you through how you can manage and make use of a digital tool to track and analyze your environmental parameters. So with this, I would quickly hand it back over to Shankar for the final bit. Over to you, Shankar.
Thank you, Ayush, for giving us a great insight into some of these terms are pretty abstract. Some of these themes are, moving from the mundane to the sublime. When you actually see how you do all that we spoke about, it's very important to understand how we can map it, what you can measure, you can improve there. Right, friends? So just to cap this session quickly, what are the key takeaways? What did we learn? What did we see today? So we spoke about the context, the global context, the confluence of parties, and how the companies in APAC are setting with more urgency net zero targets. We saw the number of companies and a progression there since Glasgow and what happened since Egypt there. A lot of companies and nations are also following suit. Companies do need to identify environmental factors material to the operations, but a couple of questions relating to that. But each environmental factor affects different companies differently, depending on the nature of the operations, locations, etc. So assessing the material and key factors will help organizations set appropriate priorities to how to manage their environmental impact. So that's the answer to understanding what to take, what's the actions you take. To jump into action, take carbon, water, waste, what you do. So this kind of is an effort. We'll talk about materiality in a bit here. We spoke about the key material topics, emissions, water, waste, and biodiversity, and how we can take efforts. We give examples of some companies and which are more material to each sectors, and looking at how we can ensure mindful use of resources. Organization reporting and improving the impact on the environment there. How do you report? The appropriate metrics, the E metrics as we speak, can make all the difference. And we spoke about just 2 global frameworks and 1 Indian one, a real holistic framework to report on ESG here. And finally, Ayush took us through the digital tools that can really leverage your e-progression there. Right, friends? So that's what we've seen today. We had some very interesting questions in the chat box there. Yes, Praveen Kumar, Indrajit, Sandhya, Parthiban, we will share also session 1. We'll share I think if you follow our handle, you will definitely get some of that already. If not, we'll ensure that you get a copy of the recording and some of the slides are embedded as part of that. Sustainability is also about open and transparent sharing. So we'll be happy to do that here. Divya, materiality best practices. Yes, many of them here. How do you do it? It's as simple as, you could do it by, I think the best way here, you could do a multi-voting and do a survey. You could do it through Google Forms, administer it across the various stakeholders to understand what's top priority to them, what's important to you and what's important to the stakeholders, the impact and the implications thereof. But the important way is to really ensure it is inclusive there. You have a representation, a total inclusiveness in the way you do materiality, regardless of the tool you use. That Divya would be the best way to look at practicing best materiality practices. One of the best parts of sustainability is it's all reported. Any company, any sector you wish, you can go up, see the website, see how they report materiality. What the stakeholder mapping and how they ensure that the voices of the stakeholders are met, and how do they map the priorities as appropriate there. Khushbu, on Havells, there's again, like I said, similar, there's a nice case study published in their website there. Their commitment is on Havells, if you want a little bit more, how they go about taking, it all begins with the leadership, the commitment they take to ensuring a greener tomorrow. Like they said, Havells, like a lot of the FMCG companies, a lot of the white goods companies, Philips included, offer a take back, Blue Star, and recycling services that adheres to the one, of course, it looks at the e-waste management rules 2016 by the Ministry of Environment and Forests India. But when an environmental or electronic product is, reaches the end of life, they take it back and recycle it here. Yeah. Shubhi spoke about scope 2, the question about how we can reduce that. So there's a nice simple calculation. Most of the calculations on emissions scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 are simpler templates. And the advantage is if you can get power from the grid, have an open access system, you can abate your own carbon footprint of scope 2 also. That's one way you can do it and save bought out electricity there. You can do it yourself or you can buy it from the grid. Green source is one way you could do that. I guess that looks at most of the questions in the chat box there. I think bang on time at the stroke of 12:30. We want to say a thank you to all of you for being part of this wonderful session. I know that the deep dive was, I thought, the most interesting part, but I see a lot of interest coming up with the opener, which was just the the one that got you started there. We have, as we said, we'll be part of a 5-part series. There's coming more on S and G and the overall expectations there. So I'm sure any of the questions you have, we'll be happy to share more information as appropriate. Right, Alicia, are we good to go?
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Ayush. Thank you, everyone, for attending. You will also see a poll on your screen at the moment. So please answer before you leave. And thank you.
Stay well and be green. Thank you, everybody. Yes, thank you, Sundar. The sustainable supply chain is the best way. Those 10 parameters are the way to go on going green. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you for your participation. And thank you for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you for your participation. Thanks a lot.